I think that we sometimes get quite hung up on the social context, but also the literary context is helpful. So thinking about the connection between Eliot's poetry and French symbolism, thinking about the way in which imagism is a kind of descendant of the tradition of the French symbolists like Laforgue, even bringing in some of the psychoanalytic material with Freud or Jung and how these figures might influence some of the representation of the psyche in Eliot's poetry. So yeah, thinking about not just the social factors, but also the literature, the research work that is being conducted in his time. I think you mentioned Nietzsche as well, and how that might influence some of the representations of religion, or a feeling as if religious values are being questioned. Cool. What about some of the other social factors that might be informing Eliot's poetry? So what do you think might be the relevance of his personal context, like his marriage, to some of the poems that are set for study? It's interesting perhaps how some of those personal doubts and questions coming through in his personal life might show through into the essay. You don't want to end up psychoanalyzing Eliot, the person, but that can certainly help bring a little bit of clarity into some of the images that he offers. His own religious journey and denominational switching and such is also perhaps something that we see from his personal context rub off on the poetry. So another part of the literary context behind Eliot's poetry, it is a departure from Romanticism and thinking about modernism as a literary mode. I tend to find in a lot of students' works, the term modernism gets misused. Modernism, in the way that we should generally be applying it, is not the same as modernity or the modern era, but we are usually wanting to think about modernism as a literary or an artistic mode, and we're going to have a look at exactly what that is, why it is a departure from Romanticism. In the rubric, it does place some emphasis on context. It says that students need to evaluate notions of context with regard to the text's composition and reception. So I've thought here about some of the contextual factors that might be there within the text's composition. In terms of its reception, we can also think about how our social context impacts the way we read the text. Or when you bring in critics, it can often be interesting to consider how the social context behind the critic contributes to their reading of Eliot's poetry. Does the poetry take on different meanings if the critic is approaching it through the lens of some of the social upheavals of the 1960s? Or does it take on a different resonance if it is read after the Second World War, immediately after the Second World War? So you can bring context in actually several ways, not just Eliot's own context. So we come back to that notion of how the poetry transcends time, how it resonates with us despite shifts in time. So we've got these two factors in terms of Eliot's context, the context within his composition, the historical context and the literary context. In terms of the historical context, we often start with this notion of the modern world and all of its potential permutations, what it means to live in modernity, what the modern man's, and I use the gendered term very particularly, struggle is within the modern world. There's this quote here that is about modernity, not limited just to the modern age, however we define that, but all of modernity, which is to be modern is to experience personal and social life as a maelstrom, to find one's world and oneself in perpetual disintegration and renewal, trouble and anguish, ambiguity and contradiction. This is a really nice encapsulation of, I think, what the modern world is and its contradictions. It's, I think, easy to look at Eliot's poetry and dismiss it as nihilistic, and I think that would be an unfair accusation of Eliot's poetry. It may be toys with nihilism, it is shaped by nihilism, but it is part of this perpetual contradictory process of disintegration and renewal. There is a lot of anguish and trouble, but also a little bit of the possibility of a vivacious modern world is dormant within some of Eliot's poems. So we don't just want to have a very simplistic understanding of what the modern world was. We know already, for example, that Eliot and his poetry resists a lot of the codes of Romanticism. So it's not like Eliot is like Wordsworth in saying that we should retreat from the urban into rural spaces because that's the only place in which human emotion can be truly cultivated and renewed. That's too distant from actually what Eliot's purpose is. So if we talk entirely about the bleakness of the modern world, it probably doesn't quite do justice to what Eliot's perspective might be. Instead, he views a world that is in decline, but is almost mourning for how the possibilities of modernity have not been fully realised in its actuality.